Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Pod Is Cast. This episode I'm going to be talking about Napoleon's greatest victory, the Battle of Austerlitz in December of 1805. Now before I get into the battle itself, I just want to give a little bit of background on Napoleon, his army, and the War of the Third Coalition. So Napoleon was born in August of 1769 on the island of Corsica. His parents were both Corsican nationalists and small-time nobles, who actually led guerrilla forces to repel the French invasion of the island in 1768. Now, his father realized the war was actually lost, so he surrendered before it had officially concluded, and because of this, the French looked favorably upon Carlo Bonaparte, and he was able to receive French nobility status. It didn't really come with any benefit other than he could send his children to get educated in France. Now, Napoleon was actually a recipient of a scholarship, which means that he could even go for free to get educated at the French military schools. They were kind of looking for the best and brightest to fill their ranks of the officer corps with. And when Napoleon went to school, he was actually bullied for being a Corsican nationalist. He was a diehard Corsican who hated the French and everything they stood for. He didn't really speak French because he didn't want to. His mother tongue was Corsican and Italian. He spoke with a really distinct Corsican accent they bullied him for. And he was pretty poor, actually. Even though his family were of noble status, on Corsica, that really just meant that they didn't starve. They had enough land to grow plenty of food, but otherwise they were not wealthy by any standards. Now, Napoleon graduated school when he was 16 and became a second lieutenant in the artillery corps. Slowly worked his way up through the ranks. And then the French Revolution hit. Now, he actually kind of missed the French Revolution. He was cheering as a fan from the sidelines, but he didn't actually get to play any role in it. He loved the Enlightenment, everything it stood for. But he had bigger issues at the time. His family was in a ton of debt. His father had died. He didn't have much money because he was spending it all on books. But otherwise, he was just going to keep going back to Corsica to help his family out. In fact, by the time he reached 99 months service in the French army, he'd spent 58 of those months helping out his family. He hadn't been in France for 58 months because he was on vacation and leave to try and solve his family's debt crisis. They eventually get solved when a great uncle dies. But otherwise, that's pretty much, he's using every excuse he could get to gain power in Corsica, not have to be in France, and read. That's pretty much all he did. By the time that his family's money troubles are solved, he's back in France with his little brother. They're living in a shabby apartment in Paris. Napoleon's only eating about one meal a day because he's spending all of his money on books. That's all he would buy. And he just read as much as he could get his hands on. He kind of educates himself in science and math and history, becomes extremely literate, really, really smart. And by the time he's emperor, a couple years later, he's able to hold his own in conversations with the top scientists and mathematicians of the world. He even writes his own commentaries for Caesar. He translates Caesar's Gallic Wars and other books himself into French and then writes his own commentaries on that. It's pretty impressive. Napoleon is able to become an artillery commander. He fights some of his own men, kills some Frenchmen. Otherwise, he's just kind of a really smart commander that catches the eye of a bunch of the French high command. Another important thing to note with the French Revolution, so many people under the Jacobin rule were being executed that the French were constantly having to advance these young men up through the ranks just to fill in all the gaps for the generals they were missing. So Napoleon and what would later become his marshals, Michel Ney, André Massena, Louis Davout, they all are able to become generals because of the Enlightenment. There's a little asterisk by that because they're replacing people who get beheaded left and right. Another important factor for Napoleon is his wife, Josephine. She's a pretty interesting character. She was born in Haiti. She didn't have any teeth because as a child she chewed on sugar cane, rotted her teeth away. So she had this really weird smile. You can even see it in paintings of her. It's just this odd facial expression to hide her teeth. Now, when she comes to France, she's married to a really abusive guy. They have a couple of kids together, one of whom rises to prominence. But other than that, He's just kind of the run-of-the-mill asshole wife beater. But luckily for her, he gets arrested because he's an anti-Jacobin. So she gets thrown in prison. He gets beheaded. And the only reason she doesn't get beheaded is because while she's in prison, she gets too sick to be guillotined. They wouldn't guillotine sick people, and they wouldn't guillotine pregnant people. She was too old to get pregnant again, but she got really, really sick. So they spared her just long enough for another group, the Thermidorians, to take over and kick out the Jacobins. As a result of being in this really horrible cell, I mean, she had one hole for air, 1 meal a day, it was stale bread, a single bucket of water. She was in a room that had brains splattered on it from when they executed a bunch of priests in there. And she was in the room with 5 other women, 4 of whom got executed. So she had tons of problems and PTSD, but after she gets out of prison, she gets her children back and kind of has this resolve to climb her way back to the top. So she starts having all these affairs with prominent Frenchmen. And she actually becomes nicknamed government property. And she had this one, it's written about in a ton of French records. Napoleon talks about it. Talleyrand talks about it. His marshals all talk about it. She did something in bed called the zigzag. No one knows what it is. It's kind of like the move from Seinfeld. But whatever it was, it got her rank. She caught the eye of Napoleon. They soon fell in love. He actually showed up late to his wedding. He was 2 hours late because he was getting secret orders to invade Italy a little bit later. His wedding gift to her was a piece of brass that had "To Destiny" carved into it. Initially, they were really in love. Then she had an affair on him with this guy named Hippolyte Charles. And Napoleon found out and had his own affairs, and then they got back together and fell back in love, and then he ends up divorcing her later on to marry an Austrian so that he can have an heir. But other than that, they had a very loving relationship, and even after their divorce, they were close friends. Now, the second part I need to talk about before I get into the War of the Third Coalition and the Austerlitz campaign is Napoleon's reforms. So Napoleon, wherever he went, he was reforming. He reformed his army. When he invaded Italy in 1796, he reforms all of Italy. He makes the Lombardic Republic, the Cisalpine Republic, and he makes these little hotbeds of enlightenment. He kicks out the old school ruler and nobles. He brings in Enlightenment parties. He brings in scientists and mathematicians and educators. He reforms their education system. He cuts their ties with the church, and he creates these beautiful little republics that are the embodiment of the Enlightenment, just like himself. He does this in Italy. He does it in Egypt, although in Egypt it's a little different because he has to have these Enlightenment/Islamic republics that they don't really sit well, and there's some rising up against Napoleon that he ends up crushing. But other than that, he really enjoyed his time in Egypt and Italy. And he just loved creating these republics where he felt that he was spreading the Enlightenment ideals. And he really was. Now, the counter to that is that this scares the hell out of every single monarch in Europe. The Austrians are an old school family. The Prussians are an old school family. The Russians are the czars. The British have their kings and queens. And they're all opposed, and they're fearful of what the Enlightenment can do. Because what their greatest fear is that the Enlightenment ideals from France spread to their poor peasant populations that suddenly become inspired and rise up just like the French did. So even immediately after the French Revolution, Austria and Prussia and Russia and some parts of Italy and Spain and Portugal and Britain all declare war on France, and they're going to go get revenge for the beheading of Marie Antoinette and Louis. Those are kind of the pretenses for it, but in reality it's we're going to crush them and crush their soul so that the Enlightenment dies. Because again, that's really what they fear the most, is the Enlightenment spreading. And that's what Napoleon's greatest contribution is that he spreads the Enlightenment across Europe. By force, but he spreads it. Ironically, he kind of ditches the Enlightenment to become an emperor, but when he ditches it for his own personal reasons, he uses that to promote people based on their merit. His whole idea is he just wants to see a meritocracy, something that he feels he didn't get to take advantage of because he was having to be abused and bullied for being not a Frenchman, being a lesser noble, and even though he was clearly smarter than his classmates. So, once he kind of comes to power, he realizes that he's going to have to conquer Austria, Prussia, England, and Russia to win. Because if he doesn't conquer all of them, there's still a significant country opposing him that will go to whatever lengths necessary to crush him and kill the Enlightenment. Anyway, so in the War of the First Coalition, that's when all the previously mentioned countries team up to crush the French Revolution. Then there's kind of the War of the Second Coalition. That's a little bit later. That's really more his fighting off Austria and Prussia again. And then you've got the War of the Third Coalition, which is the kind of the most important one. So the War of the Third Coalition starts in 1803, and it's because, again, there's kind of these BS excuses, but Napoleon kind of realizes that it's because he's come to power. So in 1799, he comes back from Egypt, overthrows the government, and declares himself consul. This is where he really starts to mirror his life after Caesar, his hero. And so he goes away on campaign, a kind of useless, bizarre campaign in Egypt. Actually, I'll talk about that for a second because it's just so weird. Napoleon initially took over, after his success in Egypt, he comes back a hero, and he takes over the Army of England. It's named that because they were planning to invade England. He says, no, that's not practical right now. What we need to do is invade India. So the French high command goes, okay, sure, we can invade India. How are we going to get there? And he goes, oh, we'll invade through Egypt and then march from Egypt to India. It'll be easy. It makes no sense. It's really, he just makes it up to have an excuse to invade Egypt and to follow again in Caesar's footsteps. So he wages this useless campaign, just like Caesar's Gallic Wars, that do nothing but to rise or give rise to his power and his prestige, win over the people for these far-flung campaigns, and to come back with an experienced veteran corps that will be loyal to him. Because they plundered all of Egypt. And in the Battle of the Pyramids, they killed 15,000 Mamluk warriors. Each Mamluk warrior rode with his life savings. That was a tradition of theirs, was they would carry all of their worldly possessions with them into battle. So that one killed Mamluk equals one Frenchman that's set for life. So they love him. The French love him. So he comes back, he overthrows the government, declares himself consul. He has these kind of grand plans that all fall apart. He decides that he's going to reestablish a North American colony for the French. It fails because of the Haitian rebellion. They try and quell Haiti, but yellow fever and malaria, and it becomes this awful hellhole that when French soldiers find out that they're going to be sent to Haiti, they mutiny. They don't want to go. So he captures Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitians, has him executed in Paris. Oh, he dies of pneumonia, but it's kind of mysterious circumstances. And then he realizes that he can't actually take over North America again, so he sells Louisiana to America, and when he does that, he says that he has just created a power that will, quote, humble Britain with its navy. So he kind of sees this as, well, I may not get North America, but I'm going to get an ally, and I'm going to get someone who hates Britain as much as I do, and someone who will go to war with Britain. And a couple years later, that turns out to be true, because in 1812, America and Britain go back to war with each other. Anyway, the War of the Third Coalition starts when Napoleon crowns himself emperor. So after he does this, they realize, oh crap, they being the Austrians and the Prussians and the Russians and the British, they realize we have a huge problem on our hands. This pesky little bastard that's beat us all over Europe now has complete control and can reform the army whichever way he sees fit. He can rearm the army, and he can mobilize them to make it huge. That's what he does. Now, there's some debate as to what happens next, but what Napoleon does is he decides that his next course of action should be to invade England. So he creates the Army of England. He stations them on the coast, kind of in Normandy and like the Pas-de-Calais. He starts building flat-bottomed boats. Those get referenced in Winston Churchill's speech of "We shall fight them on the beaches." He talks about Napoleon's flat-bottomed boats preparing to invade England. And this is what they're in reference to. So his plan is, well, we'll load up my entire grand army onto these boats. And once we sweep aside the Royal Navy, they'll row across the channel for about 8 hours straight. Then they'll unload and conquer England. Easy peasy. Now, the trouble, of course, is that the Royal Navy at the time was the most well-trained, well-equipped, and largest navy on the planet, and it most definitely ruled the Channel, it ruled the Mediterranean, and it ruled the Atlantic. The French had no shot ever to invade England. And no one really has ever had a true chance to invade England. The last time they were invaded successfully from an outside force is you've got your 1066 Norman invasion. And then after that, in the 1500s, Wales can invade England, but that was from the same island, so it doesn't really count. So once Napoleon is emperor, he immediately does really the most important and effective thing possible, and that is he creates the corps system, CORPS. So at the time, the normal army system is columns. So you've got your first column, your second column, your third column, and these are all loosely organized, just bodies of men. So your first column may have 20,000 infantry and 10 artillery and 300 cavalry. And how the infantry would be split up would be maybe a brigade, maybe they're broken up into divisions, doesn't really matter. You have anywhere from 5 to 25,000 men, and you can kind of throw them around as you see fit. They all kind of march together. They're all one fighting force. The officers don't really know the plan. They're kind of independent. They're too independent for their own good. It's a huge mess, and it's really no one has been able to perfect it since really Frederick the Great. He's the only one that can really harness the column system. And every general is fighting the last war. So Frederick the Great, the armies that face Napoleon, at least initially, are fighting the wars of the 7 Years' War and the 30 Years' War to some extent. They're fighting the wars of Frederick the Great when they should be fighting Napoleon. Napoleon is on a totally different scale, and he always has been. When he invaded Italy in 1796, he doesn't attack them the normal way. The Austrians would send one army towards him, and he crushes them. Then they send another army, crushes them. He perfects this thing where he just has a central location, and when they send 2 or 3 armies, he crushes them individually. He denies them the ability to group together. And who could blame him? That's a perfect strategy. He's fighting against these 70, 80-year-old Austrian generals who fought in the 7 Years' War and maybe in the 30 Years' War, and they're coming together one army at a time to face this energetic young guy who moves fast, lives off the land, and has a central location from which he can strike out and destroy each army individually. So he kind of takes this idea of striking and moving as one giant body, and he creates the corps system. So what that is you have anywhere from 1 to 4 infantry divisions. And along with the infantry, you have some cavalry brigades. And along with the cavalry, you have artillery. So each corps is kind of a self-sufficient army. And the idea is march separately, fight together. So they're small enough that when they march, they don't really they don't give away where they're going. They're all separated enough that they don't take resources away from each other, and each army can sustain itself. But they're all within a day's march of each other. And they're all large enough so that if they run into the main body or a main body, they are able to hold it off for just long enough that the other corps can come. So the Grand Army that he uses in the War of the Third Coalition, which is the really important ones, are Austria and Russia. And they're paid by England to go to war with France. So England kind of subsidizes all these people to go to war with France, and they pay them millions and millions of pounds to wage war against the French. And they can afford it too. So Napoleon is up against these column systems, but he's facing them with his corps system. And these are men that were trained to invade England. They are well trained, they are well disciplined, and they're led by his new marshals. Another important thing he does is that he brings back the rank of marshal. And each marshal would be in charge of a corps. So the important ones, you've got Michel Ney, who's the bravest of the brave was his nickname. He was literally the last Frenchman out of Russia. Then you've got Louis Davout, the Iron Marshal. He never lost a battle. You've got Joachim Murat. He's kind of this flamboyant cavalry commander who always had just ridiculous uniforms. You've got Soult, kind of an idiot. One author called him a world-class plunderer from his time in France. You've got Bernadotte, who later becomes the king of Sweden. He unfortunately betrays Napoleon. And then you've got Lannes, who's kind of unknown. And then you've got Bessières, who's not really a marshal, but he holds a lot of prestige. So what Napoleon does during the War of the Third Coalition, he decides that he needs to strike first. He knows that an Austrian army has already moved across Prussia and is getting ready to invade France. And he knows that another Russian army, actually 2 Russian armies, are marching down to meet up with them. And their plan is to just have this army that is so large and unstoppable that Napoleon will have no choice but to meet them on the battlefield and get crushed. So what Napoleon does, he decides to strike first. He takes the army that was getting ready to invade England, he takes his new corps system, and he throws them into action to see how they perform. And the first thing they do is they take out an entire Austrian army at Ulm to start the campaign. Now, Ulm is a fortified town that Austrian General Mack was occupying with about 30,000 men, coupled with cavalry and artillery. And he was waiting for the Russians. Now, he was under the impression that the Russians were maybe a day or two march away, but he was wrong, because the Russians were on the Julian calendar, and the Austrians were on the Gregorian calendar. So the Russians were actually about 13 days behind, hard march behind the French. So Napoleon has plenty of time to completely encircle Ulm and order them to surrender without really a shot being fired. He captures all of their men, all of their guns, all of their horses, and he's able to... Now he's got one army out of the way. Now he just has to crush the second Austrian army and the large Russian army. So the Russians finally arrive only to find that their Austrian allies are gone. They have to fight fighting retreat, one of the most difficult maneuvers in military strategy, to escape Napoleon, and then meet up with the second Russian army. So the army under Kutuzov is the one that escapes encirclement. They meet up with the army under Alexander I, and then under Archduke Charles, a third army from the Austrians joins with the Russians. That gives about an army of almost 100,000 men, up against Napoleon's army of only about 60,000. Now, Napoleon's army only has about 60,000 because he split them up. So he sends some of his men to go capture Vienna. His quote is, "If I cannot be in England by the end of the year, I shall be in Vienna by the end of November." And he makes it on November the 12th. So Vienna has fallen, and now the Austrians are having to fight for survival with the Russians, who, if they don't escape and fight their way back to Russia, will be annihilated. Because Napoleon doesn't fight to let the army escape. He doesn't fight to just defend off. He fights to destroy. That's another thing that is really kind of different for him. In the previous wars, it had been 2 armies march, they meet on the battlefield, they have a good shootout with each other, and the loser retreats and the winner goes home too. And then they sign a treaty. Napoleon's ideal was, I will crush them, I will annihilate them, and force them to sign a treaty right here, right now, and end the war. Because he can't afford to keep fighting these wars. He can't afford it with men, and he can't afford it with money. So he has to knock out and annihilate these armies one by one, so that there's no chance, so they can buy time. So there's no chance for a quick counterattack. So he decides that what he's going to do is he will lure the Russians and the Austrians to attack his body. And while they attack his main body, the flanks will close in around them. So he'll have Davout come in from the south, from Vienna, and then all of a sudden Soult from the north, and they can meet together and crush the Russians and the Austrians. Now, there's some debate. The French are like, oh, his marshals are like, oh, they'll never take that. They're not dumb enough to take the bait, which, of course, the Russians and the Austrians take the bait. So already his plan is off to a great start. Now, Napoleon decides that the place for battle will be in Austerlitz, which is in the modern-day Czech Republic. Now, Napoleon also realizes that the key to this battle will be whoever can command the Pratzen Heights. Now, the Pratzen Heights are this really dominating series of hills, interconnected hills that create one giant wall. To the south of them, you've got the Sachin Pond, and then to the north, you've got kind of these open fields near the town of Bosenitz. So, on the Russian-Austrian army of almost 100,000 men, you've got them broken up, and this is the order of battle is, you've got the Russian Imperial Guard, so you've got 6,700 infantry, 3,700 cavalry, 100 pioneers, 40 cannons, and they're all under command of Grand Duke Constantine, who's actually the brother of Alexander I. Then you've got the advanced guard of the Tsar's army. So this is 9,200 infantry, 4,500 cavalry, and 42 guns. Now, you're about to start seeing why the column system doesn't work. Okay, then you've got the advance guard of Friedrich Wilhelm. So he's another Russian general. It's Buxhoden. 3,400 infantry, 3,400 cavalry, 12 guns. I mean, it's so confusing as to how they're even broken up because the numbers are so different. There's nothing in proportion. Some of them have 50-50 infantry artillery, or infantry cavalry. Some of them have like 60-40, some more like 80-20. The Austrians, it's even more confusing. The first column has 13,000 infantry and 250 cavalry. The other one, 11,000 infantry, 300 cavalry. Third column has 7,700 infantry, 30 light guns, no cavalry. The fourth column, under command of Collerat, has 25,000 infantrymen and no cavalry. And then you've got the fifth column, which has no infantry and only 5,000 cavalry. Then you look at the French system of order, and it's way easier to follow. It's so organized, and it makes sense. So you've got the Imperial Guard, who I'll get to in a second. There's no cavalry with the Guard, other than the Grenadiers à Cheval and the Chasseurs à Cheval and the Mamluks, who they actually weren't Mamluks, they were just Frenchmen dressed up as Mamluk warriors, and they were just light infantry, or light cavalry. So you've got some cavalry and some infantry and 24 guns. First Corps, under Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, he's the king of Sweden in a couple of years. 13,000 men, 24 guns, and its own light cavalry division. So the Corps, again, like 2 to 4 infantry divisions, cavalry division, and an artillery company. Third Corps, which was under the Iron Marshal himself, Davout, was easily the most well-trained corps in the entire French army. It's Napoleon's favorite corps, because they saved the day so many times. At the Battle of Auerstedt, they hold off and defeat the entire Prussian main army, while Napoleon fights their rear guard, thinking he's won the battle. When in fact, Davout, outnumbered almost 4-1, defeats them. So Third Corps has 4,500 men, 800 cavalry, and 12 guns. Again, a couple infantry divisions, a cavalry division, and an artillery company. And this whole pattern repeats. Now they vary in size, but everything's in proportion. So again, the Fourth Corps under Soult, 1 division, 2 division, 3 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, 1 artillery company. Same thing for Fifth Corps. So you've got 4 separate corps, and then its own Imperial Guard Corps, and then its own cavalry reserve under Murat. So again, it just makes way more sense, and they're kind of their own bodies, and they're commanded by these really competent marshals whom Napoleon has chosen based on the skill that they show. So he puts in the Enlightenment into his army, and it works for him because now he can defeat much larger armies because of competent commanders and well-trained men. So his order, the way he deploys, is really the important thing. That's what wins him the battle. He actually gives up command of the Pratzen Heights. He lets the Austrians take it so that they will be baited into attacking him. Then he stretches out the 4th Corps under Soult, so that they're an easy target, so they're bait. They're right in front of the Sachin Pond. That's Napoleon's right. So he has a purposely weakened right, with Davout close behind for reserve, so that it'll draw in as many Russians and Austrians as possible without breaking. And it'll draw them away from the Pratzen Heights. Then on his left, he has them stacked, so he has the entire 5th Corps under Laon, and that was the largest one. That had almost 20,000 men. And then on top of that, he has his Imperial Guard in reserve and 1st Corps under Bernadotte right there. So the left will be able to hold against any Russian attack, while the right will, in theory, hold its own, but it's okay if it breaks, because by the time it breaks, again, according to his strategy, the French will be able to have taken the Pratzen Heights, and now they can really command the battlefield. And everything starts out according to plan. So the Russians, of course, take the bait even against Kutuzov's warnings, and they commit 3 columns to try and crush the French right. So they believe that once they crush the right, they'll be able to swoop in and sandwich the center and the left. Which, of course, doesn't happen. The French are superbly commanded and have a brilliant fighting retreat, and in fact even make some offensive gains by the time that Davout's reinforcements under 3rd Corps come and stabilize it. So now the Russians are off the Pratzen Heights. They're trapped in the towns of Telnitz and Sokolnitz under Buxhausen, and they're just stuck there. They're fighting a stalemate against the French, which is exactly what the French want, because now the Pratzen Heights are open, and it's really foggy. That's another important thing. It's extremely foggy this morning, so the Russians can't really see what the French center is doing. Then under Prince Bagration, for the Russian commander, he gets impatient, so he launches an ill-suited attack onto the French left that doesn't do anything. That turns into a stalemate, again, as predicted, exactly what the French want. And now you've got Saint Hilaire and Vendôme's, not corps, but divisions, free to attack the Pratzen Heights. So suddenly about 10,000 Frenchmen start to march up these heights once Napoleon thinks the time is ready. And Kutuzov's sitting there, and he can't see anything. Well, suddenly, the sun of Austerlitz breaks the fog, and out of nowhere, they just see thousands and thousands of Frenchmen coming. And so they break. They give up command of the Pratzen Heights. The battle isn't over, but it's pretty much over. So now, the Russian left, which is engaging the French right, to no avail, even though they're supposed to have just crushed them by now, outnumber the French 2-1 and still have no superiority whatsoever, and are in fact losing positions to the French. The French are making gains against these numerically superior Russian forces. Then on the French left, the Russian right, they're actually starting to fall back too. So now the Russians decide that the time is right to commit their reserves under Constantine. So Archduke Constantine is commanding the Russian guards. Now for any army, if there's someone labeled guard, that means they're really the more prestigious units. For the Russians, this just meant that they were veterans, they had a little bit higher pay, and they had some cavalry and artillery with them. And he decided to commit them to the Russian right, so to try and help out Bagration, push back the French, and then they could trap them up in the Pratzen Heights. Unfortunately, once the Russians committed their reserves and they started to actually push back the French left, Napoleon ordered his Imperial Guard forward. Now, Napoleon's Imperial Guard are perhaps the most elite and powerful military unit ever. They're kind of like the SS, but better trained, and more respected and feared. And so, they are handpicked by Napoleon. These are men that have been with Napoleon from Italy to Egypt, back to Italy, and now are fighting in Austria with him. So these guys are all at least 5'10" to be in the Grenadier Guard. So these are really the main infantry. They're labeled grenadiers, but in reality that's just a title given to them because they were once grenadiers when they were Napoleon's personal guards. Now, on top of being almost 6 feet tall at minimum, they had to have at least 10 years service, which, I mean, imagine being able to survive 10 years in an army back then when the attrition rate is just horrible. These guys are getting massacred at every battle. And to be able to survive that for 10 years, at least 3 campaigns, and to show some bravery, you have to be somewhat decorated. So Napoleon knew these guys on a first-name basis, and he tended to their every need. These guys were battle-hardened, they were scarred up, mean-looking. On top of that, they wore these gigantic bearskin caps that had red feathers or green feathers and giant flaming bomb insignias on them. They had tight-cut uniforms to really show off their bodies, and they wore bright blue coats with white shirts and sashes. On top of that, they also carried their own swords, and they loved the bayonet. That's really what they were used for, is they would break enemy morale and momentum by just bayonet charging, even if it didn't really make sense to do so at the time. Napoleon rarely used them. They were so valuable to him and he loved them so much that he really only used them if they needed to turn the tide or save the battle. They were kind of like the Triarii for Scipio, Hannibal's silver shields. And they were the elite of the elite. And on top of that, they were only recruited from the elite units. So they're the elite of the elite of the elite. Now, if you were under 5'10 and you had all those qualifications, you could be on the Grenadiers à Cheval, so the Old Guard, which are the Old Guard cavalry. So again, they're just mounted grenadiers. Napoleon would even call the Old Guard his 10th Legion, Caesar's favorite legion, the Mounted Legionaries. Now, they were broken up a little differently. So you have the Old Guard, which again are the elite of the elite of the elite. And then you've got the Middle Guard, one tier under them. And then you've got the Young Guard, who are all in training to eventually become Old Guard. So Napoleon has them in reserve. He always has them in reserve. They're never frontline troops. They save the battle. They don't start the battle. And as soon as the Russians put in their Imperial Guard, Napoleon decides the time is right to commit his own. And the French break the Russians. They break the Russian morale. They scare the Russians because of these gigantic, scarred-up dudes charging at them with bayonets and swords that are happy. They were also allowed to complain. That was really another really important thing. They were called the Old Complainers, too. So they were allowed to complain without being disciplined, and Napoleon would listen to their complaints. So their main complaint was always that they missed war and they never got enough fighting done. But Napoleon knew that this was really just more talk than anything else, and that they knew it themselves. The Old Guard definitely knew that they were special troops, and that he couldn't just commit them willy-nilly because he would lose one of the central parts of his army. And on top of just being fantastic soldiers, they also served they boosted the morale of the other Frenchmen. They were propaganda soldiers just as much. They had to have mustaches, and they also had to have gold earrings so that they're even more intimidating. They're his personal bodyguards whom he loves, and he doesn't commit them very often, but when he does, it's notable. So committing them here to break the Russian attack doesn't just break it, it breaks it and then routs them. The entire Russian right collapses. Even with cavalry and artillery and infantry pouring into the French left, the French Imperial Guard just reverses everything. So now the Russian left is bogged down against the French right. Davout has stabilized the position. The Russian right is completely gone. The French left is advancing, pushing them back, chasing the retreating elements. The Russians have no more reserves left. And now the French command the Pratzen Heights. Now the Russians launch a bunch of last-ditch attacks to really try and recapture the heights, a bunch of cavalry attacks. That almost succeeds. They commit the life guards of the Russians. That also almost succeeds, but the French hold their ground and they beat them off after tons and tons of heavy fighting. Now the Russian left, realizing what's just happened, gets the order to retreat. But it's too late, so they can't actually do it. Now all the French troops on top of the Pratzen Heights come in and collapse. They come in from behind and completely shatter the Russian line on the Russian left. And as the Russian troops start to retreat and flee across the Sachin Pond, Napoleon orders his artillery to fire onto the ice, break the ice, and have the men drown. Now, he claims to have killed 20,000 fleeing Russians, when in reality, excavations later on have shown maybe 3,000 or 4,000. Still an incredible number, and not very many guns or horses, but lots of men drowned because he broke the ice as they're running away. So Napoleon ends up inflicting almost 36,000 casualties to a loss of less than 10,000 of his own. That's not really killed so much as it is wounded, as are most battles during this time period. But he inflicts a 4-1 casualty. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. It forces the Austrians to sign the Treaty of Pressburg. So at 36 years old, Napoleon ends the Holy Roman Empire. It ceases to exist because he defeats them at Austerlitz. The Russians have to retreat, at least what's left of them, have to retreat and meet up with the Prussians, and then Napoleon ends up crushing them too at the Battle of Auerstadt-Jena. This is the most brilliant moment of his career. Now, the 1813 and 1814 campaigns, he has also some pretty brilliant battles and fighting retreats and everything, but they're never to the scale of importance as they are at Austerlitz. He ends the War of the Third Coalition right then and right there. The next day, he meets with Francis I of Austria. He makes the Austrians give up all their possessions in Italy. He makes them give up all their possessions in Germany. They lose 2 million subjects whom they can no longer tax. And then, in true Napoleonic Enlightenment fashion, creates the Confederation of the Rhine, a series of German states, all of them Enlightenment ideals that he totally reforms and helps with for the education system to create, again, these little hotbeds of enlightenment. Now, of course, the war isn't really truly over because the War of the Third Coalition immediately becomes the War of the Fourth Coalition. Just means that the Austrians don't have an army anymore, and the Russians really don't have an army. So the Russians have to send more and more men who now have to team up with the Prussians because there's this giant army of the Enlightenment on their southern border that's coming to free their peasants and their own fears. And so Napoleon crushes them too. The battles of Auerstadt and Jena. At the Battle of Jena, Napoleon believes that he has defeated the main Prussian army, when in fact, Davout has outnumbered like 3-1. That's another fantastic battle, but that's a story for a different time. The point is that Napoleon, even in his own estimation, his highest moment is Austerlitz. A year to the day after he proclaimed himself Emperor of France, he has just defeated a Russian field army, actually 2 Russian field armies and an Austrian field army. Almost 100,000 men are defeated by 60,000. The 60,000 only take 9,000 casualties, while the 100,000 take 36,000 casualties. It's really one of the most brilliant moments of Napoleon's career. And it shows the armies of Russia and Prussia and Austria that they are no longer fighting the same wars that they were fighting even 10 years earlier. They're now fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and they have to reform their own armies. And so they do. Unfortunately for Napoleon, the Jena campaign in Prussia and the Austerlitz campaign in Austria show the old European monarchies that they have to adopt the core system. They have to adopt it or die. And so they do adopt it, and by this time, Napoleon is now fighting the last war. And so in 1813, after his failed invasion of Russia, he's defeated by a bunch of allied armies and forced into exile in Elba. But again, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. The next episode will probably be on Rommel, or maybe another Napoleonic War episode, just because there's so many battles and so much to go into. But thank you guys so much for listening, and tune in next time.